For the first time, Erwin Rommel felt the chill of defeat creeping in. Until now, blitzkrieg had been an unstoppable force, slicing through France like a hot knife through butter. But at Arras, in the spring of 1940, something cracked. A blade of British steel came down from the north to sever the German advance. Out of the dust came the Matildas. Heavily armored, impervious to standard anti-tank weapons, they crashed into Rommel's exposed flank with brutal force. A sudden, savage counterattack, one that threatened to tear the German spearhead apart and turn the entire campaign upside down. Rommel had built his name on speed, shock, and unrelenting attack. He understood better than anyone that war was momentum. And right now, that momentum was slipping from his grasp. He turned his full attention to Arras. The counterattack had to be stopped, now. Quote, every gun, both anti-tank and anti-aircraft, was ordered to open rapid fire immediately. I personally gave each gun its target. With enemy tanks so perilously close, only rapid fire from every gun could save the situation. He was so locked in with stopping the British tanks that he didn't even notice when his orderly was shot dead at his side. The bullet that could have killed him missed by inches. Blinded by tunnel vision, he failed to see it. He was making one of the most critical mistakes of the war. He wasn't fighting the enemy he thought he was. An unprepared force. The idea of an unstoppable Wehrmacht did not exist before May 1940. When France and Britain declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland, political and military leaders in both nations publicly mocked the Germans. They knew Germany's forces had only recently been rebuilt and could not hope to confront the massive professional armies of the West, armies that had been preparing for war for years and had not been crippled by the Treaty of Versailles. 45% of those conscripted into the German military were over 40 years old, and 50% had received only 6 weeks of training or were reservists being recalled to service. Despite Germany's push toward tank production, its ability to maintain a fully motorized force was severely limited by fuel shortages. By late 1939, the German High Command realized their fuel reserves were not enough and executed an urgent demotorization program. Horses replaced trucks in many units, allowing the Wehrmacht to conserve fuel for priority motorized divisions. The disparity in motorization was stark. France's military operated approximately 300,000 vehicles, while Germany had only around 120,000. The perception of German technological superiority was largely a myth. Its motor industry in the 1920s and 30s was far smaller than that of France or Britain, and it was completely overshadowed by American automobile production. This forced reliance on horses was not a novelty. In World War I, Germany had used 1.4 million horses, and by World War II, that number had risen to 2.7 million. Nazi propaganda films, often produced by Joseph Goebbels, showcased tanks, half-tracks, and Stukas, but those images concealed the reality that most of the German army still marched on foot or rode on horseback. By May 1940, Germany had assembled approximately 157 divisions for its campaign. However, only 16 of these divisions were fully motorized, and just 6 of them were panzer divisions. Furthermore, only half of the 157 divisions were considered combat-ready by German standards. On paper, the Allies held a significant numerical and qualitative advantage in armor. The Germans had amassed 2,439 tanks, while the combined Allied forces fielded 4,204, with France deploying 3,254 and the British Expeditionary Force contributing another 310. It is often assumed that German equipment was superior throughout the war, but in reality, the tanks available to Germany in the spring of 1940 were in many cases outclassed by their Allied counterparts in both firepower and armor protection. The Panzer IV, one of the most powerful German tanks at the time, had only 30 millimeters of armor, whereas the French Char B1 was protected by 60, and the British Matilda II boasted 80 millimeters, making it nearly impervious to most German anti-tank weapons. The firepower disparity was just as striking. The French Somua S-35 and Char B1, armed with a 47mm gun, could penetrate 80 millimeters of armor at 180 meters, more than enough to punch through any German tank on the battlefield. The Panzer III, the most common German tank in service at the time, carried a 37mm gun that could tear through 64mm of armor from 100 meters. Even the Matilda II, fitted with a 40mm 2-pounder gun, could penetrate 53mm of armor at 500 meters, making it more effective at range than most German tanks. These figures challenge the notion of German armored superiority and expose an even deeper misconception, that in 1940, Germany fielded a fully mechanized and overwhelmingly powerful military force. The reality was different. Of the 157 divisions assembled by May, only 6 were fully equipped panzer divisions and just 10 were motorized. The majority of the German army still moved at the speed of their own feet or the hooves of their horses. Despite the overwhelming Allied advantage in numbers and technology, the Germans had an ace up their sleeve. The German strategy of blitzkrieg, lightning war, did not rely on superior equipment, but on speed, coordination, and operational flexibility. Instead of engaging in direct, grinding battles of attrition, German forces bypassed defensive positions, outmaneuvered slower-moving enemy units, and rapidly encircled entire armies. What should have been a slow, methodical campaign turned into a shock offensive that shattered the confidence of the Allied command. By the time the Allies realized the full extent of the German threat, it was too late. The Wehrmacht, a force that by all conventional measures should have been weaker, had brought the military superpowers of Europe to their knees in a matter of weeks. A miracle. To Hitler and other German strategists, the invasion was not just going well, it was a miracle beyond their wildest dreams. Hitler had hoped his few mechanized panzer divisions would gain ground quickly before the war devolved into a drawn-out conflict of attrition, reminiscent of World War I. Initially, the German strategy had been based on Directive 6, but after shifting to Manstein's audacious plan of pushing through the Ardennes, Hitler's confidence soared. Private accounts suggest that he predicted the campaign would not last more than 6 weeks. Yet, there's considerable evidence that he expected a prolonged and costly fight. In private, he confided to his high command that he anticipated 1 million German casualties in the campaign against France. The quick advance of the Wehrmacht took everyone, including Hitler himself, by surprise. Then the attacks began, and Hitler was almost as shocked as the rest of the world. In fact, he feared it was too good to be true. As a World War I veteran, he knew the dangers of overextending. In 1918, German troops had launched a desperate push to end the war, reaching the Marne River, just 70 kilometers from Paris, only to be halted and driven back in the 100 Days Offensive, the beginning of Germany's collapse. Now, Hitler feared a similar disaster. He knew that victories gained too fast could be deceptive, that overconfidence could be the Wehrmacht's undoing. General Franz Halder recorded in his journal, quote, "The Führer is terribly nervous. Frightened by his own success, he would prefer to curb our initiative." His concerns were not unfounded. Even the most advanced armies in history had suffered catastrophic reversals due to logistical failures, and the German army, for all its momentum, was not invincible. The Allies saw an opportunity. With German panzer divisions having advanced so far, Churchill compared the situation to, quote, "a tortoise that's extended his head too far out of his shell." In a meeting with Maurice Gamelin, commander-in-chief of the French armed forces, Churchill suggested that all they needed to do was sever the neck. If the Allies struck at the German supply lines, they could flip the situation and encircle the panzer spearheads, cutting them off from fuel and reinforcements. Gamelin agreed and issued Directive No. 12, ordering Allied forces from both the north and south of the German salient to attack simultaneously. But that same night, disaster struck. Gamelin was sacked as commander-in-chief and blamed for the dire situation France found itself in. His replacement, General Maxime Weygand, arrived and, in a catastrophic lapse of judgment, cancelled Directive No. 12. The French command failed to grasp the urgency of the situation. Weygand believed the front lines would stabilize and expected a prolonged campaign. Rather than immediately acting, he took the next day to meet with military and political leaders, making a series of ceremonial visits, at the moment demanding decisive action. On May 21st, he flew to meet General Gaston-Henri Belot, overseeing French forces at the collapsing front, to assess the situation personally. However, due to the chaotic state of French logistics, it took him more than 15 hours to return to headquarters. Those lost hours, in the scope of the campaign, proved disastrous. Finally, on May 22nd, Weygand ordered the execution of what he called the Weygand Plan, which was effectively Directive No. 12, but 3 days too late. In a World War I-style campaign, 3 days might have been of little importance to the overall scheme of things. but in the era of blitzkrieg, it was an eternity. The Germans were advancing at a tempo their adversaries failed to match. The French response, slow and fragmented, played right into their hands. Under the plan, Billot was to attack from the north, while General Robert Altmeier's 10th Army would strike from the south. Billot was responsible for coordinating the operation and organizing scattered French units into an effective counterattack to sever the tortoise's neck. Then fate intervened. Billot was involved in a car crash, suffering fatal injuries. Without him, the attack was delayed yet again. On May 23rd, realizing that the French command was paralyzed, General Lord Gort, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, made a decision. Seeing that neither Weygand nor the French High Command could coordinate a meaningful counterattack, he ordered British forces to move north toward the coast. He was already thinking about evacuation, anticipating the collapse to come. His decision, though tactical, signaled to many that the battle for France was already lost. Weygand canceled his version of Directive 12 on May 27th. The strategic consequences were unprecedented. France had no replacement ready who could immediately take over and make the necessary decisions. The delay created confusion among the French forces, leaving the Germans free to exploit their hesitation. The French had both the numerical and technological advantage. If the counteroffensive had been carried out as planned, it could have blunted the German advance, possibly even reversing much of their gains. Instead, Hitler's miracle was complete. The British and French command structures operated independently of each other, with little communication in between, leading to blatant inefficiencies and delays. Meanwhile, the Germans, though stretched thin, maintained discipline and cohesion, as well as the all-too-important element of surprise. Directive number 12, France's last hope of turning the tide, was gone. The French command was completely eroded. But in a small town called Arras, British forces were not done yet, and they were about to attempt a defiant and aggressive counterattack that would remind the Germans how fragile their miracle really was. Arras. Major General Harold Franklin had just reached his new headquarters in Arras, precisely as the disaster of the Battle of France was unfolding. Urgently dispatched from Belgium, Franklin arrived amidst frantic realization. The main German assault was not through Belgium, but through the Ardennes. As Rommel's relentless 7th Panzer Division stormed ever closer to Arras, crucial as the British Expeditionary Force's vital supply hub, Franklin made a desperate decision. He would do what Allied leaders had failed to accomplish with Directive 12. He would let Rommel's spearhead pass, then strike swiftly from the north to sever the German advance before Arras could fall. Franklin's forces were severely depleted from the hurried retreat out of Belgium, their tanks battered and engines strained from the grueling race southward. Nevertheless, he still had at his command 2 infantry battalions, 58 Matilda I tanks, 16 powerful Matilda II tanks, 14 agile Vickers 6B tanks, and 2 artillery batteries, reinforced by 2 anti-tank platoons. With time running out, Franklin divided his forces into 2 columns, under the experienced command of Giffard Lequesne Martel. Martel was a veteran officer who had served in World War I, dedicated his career to tanks, authored pivotal writings on mechanized warfare, and even contributed to tank design. Now, he finally had the chance to prove his theories in the heat of combat. Tanks and troops trickled into Arras, exhausted from their frantic withdrawal from Belgium. There was almost no time for reconnaissance or comprehensive planning. Soldiers and tank crews, barely briefed, struggled to understand their mission amid chaos and confusion. No coordination between infantry, tanks, and supporting units before launching the assault. The desperate plan involved 2 columns, sweeping southward from Vimy, north of Arras, executing a fierce pincer attack to sever the advancing German spearhead. But lack of preparation quickly turned into disarray. The 7th Royal Tank Regiment lost cohesion, drifting westward and losing crucial contact with the Durham Light Infantry. French forces tried to join in support, but inadvertently triggered chaos, mistakenly firing upon British troops before realizing their grave error. Coordination between French and British units collapsed entirely. They operated on separate radio networks, increasing the panic and confusion of combat operations. Accounts mention commanders jumping out of their vehicles, scrambling desperately between tanks, shouting in alarm, quote, "What net are we on? How do we pass messages?" Despite the chaos, the 4th Royal Tank Regiment pressed forward, encountering Rommel's exposed support units, motorized transports, artillery, and logistics teams, utterly unprepared for a determined counterattack. British armor tore into the German 6th Rifle Regiment with shocking ferocity, throwing enemy ranks into immediate chaos and disrupting a force that had grown accustomed to minimal resistance. German infantry and anti-tank gun crews hastily deployed, pouring desperate fire onto advancing British tanks. Sergeant H.D. Reed, commanding a Matilda, recalled, quote, "Earth erupted around us, explosions jolting the tank. Ahead, Squadron Sergeant Major Armet's turret took repeated, punishing hits. Everyone fired relentlessly, desperately." Reed continued his description of the battle, quote, "Unable to neutralize an anti-tank gun concealed near a railway bridge, I targeted 2 nearby trucks instead. A sudden, blinding explosion followed. An ammunition lorry vanished in smoke and flame, eliminating the gun emplacement. German infantry recoiled in horror as their 37mm shells bounced harmlessly off the thickly armored Matildas. However impenetrable, British tanks suddenly were set ablaze as external stowage bins ignited, creating an almost surreal scene where burning tanks continued to surge forward, decimating the Germans. The Matildas ruthlessly crushed enemy anti-tank positions beneath their tracks, machine gun fire cutting down fleeing gun crews. Some French platoons joined the chaotic assault, amplifying the carnage and further threatening to sever Rommel's lifeline. Upon receiving panicked reports, Rommel urgently reversed his advance, desperately trying to regain control of the deteriorating situation. For the German infantry, the battle swiftly became unbearable. Their anti-tank defenses were annihilated. Troops faced unprecedented casualties. Morale was shattered completely. Within minutes, German riflemen broke rank, abandoning vehicles and equipment, fleeing wildly on foot and in whatever vehicles still functioned, racing desperately southward to escape the catastrophic defeat. Utter chaos. Like Hitler, General Major Erwin Rommel understood the lethal gamble of overextending his forces. He was racing to isolate Arras from the west when dire news arrived. His rear lines were under relentless attack. His worst fears were materializing. A coordinated Allied pincer maneuver aimed directly at severing his vulnerable spearhead. Rommel had been astonished at how swiftly they had penetrated enemy lines, yet he harbored no illusions about their fragile position. He knew all too well that the moment the Allies deciphered Germany's intentions and coordinated a devastating counterattack, the entire campaign could be brought to an end. Determined not to bear responsibility for this collapse, Rommel prepared for a ferocious defensive struggle, readying his forces for what could be their final stand. He commanded a mixed force of 36 Panzer IV tanks and 106 Panzer 38Ts, both dangerously outmatched in armor and firepower by the imposing British Matildas. Rommel knew the odds were stacked against him, but he possessed a grim trump card, the feared Flak 88. Initially engineered to target high-altitude aircraft, the Germans recognized the 88mm gun's effectiveness against armored vehicles as early as 1938. Originally intended to breach the concrete fortifications of the Maginot Line, these devastating shells now represented their only hope against the seemingly impenetrable Matildas. The German and British forces closed in on each other with precision, their collision course becoming inevitable. The numerically superior Germans advanced aggressively, unaware they were hurtling toward an enemy fewer in number, yet heavily armored and intimidatingly resilient, though lightly armed. Fate cruelly set both forces to attack simultaneously at precisely 2 p.m. on May 21st. In a sudden and furious strike, the British 4th Royal Tank Regiment shattered the German infantry positions, rolling swiftly through the towns of Achicourt, Agny, and Beaurain. British infantry rapidly secured the latter 2 towns, allowing the tanks to surge urgently toward the strategic elevation of Telegraph Hill. Rommel, sensing imminent catastrophe, personally intervened, urgently moving forward his heavy artillery and the 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The scale of the threat remained unclear to Rommel, but the devastation inflicted on his infantry convinced him that multiple Allied divisions must be closing in. Anxiety deepened with every passing minute. He recalled, quote, "Both anti-tank and anti-aircraft was ordered to open rapid fire immediately. I personally gave each gun its target. With enemy tanks so perilously close, only rapid fire from every gun could save the situation." Rommel abandoned his original mission and became utterly committed to saving his division from total annihilation. He became so fixated on managing the desperate firefight that he hardly noticed when his orderly fell lifeless beside him, a victim of the intense enemy fire. With mounting dread, Rommel dispatched an urgent, panicked message warning headquarters of an assault by at least 5 divisions, describing himself engulfed by, quote, hundreds of enemy tanks and following infantry. He remained entirely unaware that just 74 operational British tanks, many disoriented themselves, were causing such havoc. Rommel's relentless obsession finally began yielding results as the 88mm rounds tore effortlessly through the thick armor of the Matildas. Compounding the British catastrophe, Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers appeared ominously overhead, their screaming dives and explosive payloads plunging the battlefield into an appalling hellscape. One after another, British tanks were set ablaze, this time for real, halting their momentum abruptly. Amid the carnage, Lieutenant Colonel J.G. Fitzmaurice, commander of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment, attempted to maintain control from his Mark 6B tank. A single round tore through the armored hull, then through him, shattering British command. Moments later, reconnaissance officer 2nd Lieutenant Peter Vaux reached the site of the escalating disaster. Shocked by the rapidly worsening conditions, he grimly reported, quote, "Up to that moment, the battle had been great fun. We'd enjoyed it. But when we reached this line of field guns, we could go no further. I was sent off to contact some tanks to tell them to pull back to Achicourt. Some small anti-tank guns opened fire on my light tank, and a shot went in through the left of the turret, just behind my gunner's head, and out through the right of the turret, just behind my head. I suppose we both turned a bit pale. Within minutes, the regiment lost 20 tanks, and British commanders frantically issued orders to withdraw. As their shattered forces retreated under sustained fire, isolated German tanks from the scattered Panzer Regiment 25 arrived late, desperately launching small counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. Though their assaults failed, the battlefield remained a terrifying spectacle of chaos and smoke, the echoes of gunfire and cries of the wounded fading into the grim dusk. Rommel faces a reversal. Rommel's intense personal involvement in countering the British assault caused him to lose track of his critical armored formations. Panzer Regiment 25 had already reached its assigned objectives earlier in that day, but now sat idle, anxiously awaiting further orders. By the time Rommel had regained his composure and clarity to survey the larger strategic picture, twilight was already settling ominously over the battlefield. At precisely 7 p.m., Colonel Karl Rotenberg, commanding Panzer Regiment 25, finally received urgent instructions to launch an attack into the rear of the British columns. Rotenberg immediately sent his tanks charging forward, but they ran headlong into an ambush. The British 260th Anti-Tank Battery, concealed in darkness, opened devastating fire with their 2-pounder guns. German armor crumbled under punishing volleys, while simultaneously, French tanks from the 3rd Division Légion Mécanique crashed violently into their exposed flank. Over a dozen German panzers erupted in flames, along with several French heavy tanks and British anti-tank guns. By 11 p.m., battered and bloodied, Rotenberg's regiment was ordered to halt, its momentum utterly shattered. Yet Rommel, unwilling to concede defeat, pressed forward. At midnight, he launched his 2 infantry regiments into a fierce assault. The German 6th Infantry quickly overwhelmed a British machine gun company, while the 7th Infantry stormed violently into the village of Vorlis. Explosions rocked the town as artillery and mortar shells ignited massive fires. British infantry from the 8th Durham Light Infantry fought amidst the flames, ammunition dwindling dangerously. Just when the defenders faced annihilation, salvation arrived. 6 French tanks, accompanied by 2 armored troop carriers, broke through German lines, guns blazing. The besieged British infantry rallied around this armored relief, fighting fiercely to break free and withdraw to Vimy Ridge. The brutal, desperate battle at Arras had finally reached its bloody end. The improvised counterattack on May 21st had failed to sever the German advance. Lack of coordination between British and French units, along with the limited number of available tanks and troops, had made success practically impossible. Yet this hurried and chaotic strike had profound, unforeseen consequences. Rommel had lost approximately 40 tanks, suffered 600 casualties, and most of his critical anti-tank guns were destroyed. Shaken and confused, Rommel mistakenly reported being attacked by hundreds of enemy tanks, either exaggerating to mask his errors or genuinely overwhelmed by confusion during the fierce combat. His reports alarmed the German high command, even Hitler himself, who believed a repeat of World War I was about to happen, prompting them to redirect vital panzer divisions toward Arras. By hindering Rommel's blitzkrieg, The Arras counterattack bought precious time for the Allies to establish defenses around Dunkirk. Rommel's paranoia, compounded by Hitler's fear of overstretching his armored spearheads, resulted in the infamous decision to halt German tanks short of Dunkirk, entrusting the Luftwaffe to finish off the encircled Allied forces. This allowed the British to withstand long enough for the Royal Navy's evacuation to commence on May 26th. By June 4th, roughly 336,000 British, French, and Belgian troops were rescued. These troops later formed the seasoned corps of Allied forces that would fiercely battle in North Africa, Italy, and France, ultimately contributing to the liberation of occupied Europe. Though seemingly minor in the grand narrative of World War II, the Battle of Arras begs the question of what could have happened had Directive 12, a far larger, meticulously coordinated counterattack, been fully executed instead of prematurely abandoned.